Welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to play a game called Reykholt. So Reykholt is a game about greenhouses in Iceland. Yes. Because of geothermic power, because of all the volcanoes in Iceland, they grow a lot of vegetables in Iceland. And that's not all, though. Because of the volcanoes, it's quite the tourist attraction. So, with that said, food is going to be very popular in Iceland because there's going to be a lot of tourists, and you're going to need to be able to feed them. And so, those who are gardeners in this game, competition is very fierce, trying to get the best and the most as well of all the different goods in the game, vegetables that is, to basically feed all of the tourists that come to Iceland. That's basically what this game is like. Now, there's these nice little boxes here, which I put together, and they hold the food components. So we've got lettuce in here, and then that's the second most common good. This is the most common good, though, tomatoes. And so here we have tomatoes, and then the next one is mushrooms. These mushrooms are the third up, so they're about the middle. And then we have cauliflower. So we have cauliflower in here. And then the last good, which is the rarest, we have carrots. Now, you're going to be gathering goods, and you're going to be planting your goods in your greenhouses. Each player is going to start with a greenhouse, basically, and then you're going to be trying to plant, or should I say seed, your goods in your greenhouse. Now, I've actually got it set up for a solo player game, and the solo player game is only a little bit different from the 2-player game and 3-player game and 4-player game and so on. So, and there's even a story mode as well. But when you play solo, you don't play with the story mode either. But anyways, so you're going to have these greenhouses. You're going to want to get produce, or should I say vegetables, and you're going to want to seed your greenhouses and try to collect as many vegetables as you can by harvesting them and seeding them. So, normally, the person, when you play multiplayer, the person who has their little manager bottle here, each player is going to get one of these. The player who has this highest on the table tract wins the game. So that's how you win the game. Whoever has it high. Now, in order to advance up these tables, you have to have the corresponding good to pay, basically, to advance. So everybody starts over here. So in order to go here, you would need a tomato to pay it in order to move up to that table. To go here, you would have to be able to pay a lettuce. To move up to this table, you'd have to pay a mushroom, cauliflower, and a carrot. And then it becomes 2 tomatoes, 2 cabbage, 2 mushrooms, all the way up to 6 tomatoes, 6 lettuce, 6 mushrooms, 6 cauliflower, and 6 carrots, basically. And so you're going to need lots of goods in order to move up the tract. Now, this game will have 4 phases, and that's the same for the solo variant as well. The first phase is basically the worker phase, or work time. And during work time, each player is going to get 3 of these tokens in a different color, and they're going to be placing these down in the action phase. And that's what they're going to be doing, basically. That's what they're going to be doing. They're going to be placing these down to take a corresponding action on the board. That's what they're going to do. They're each going to get 3 of these. Once that phase is complete, it's harvest time. And during harvest time, for each greenhouse, you have So for each one of these you have that have goods in the greenhouse, you're going to be able to harvest one of the goods, meaning one from here, from each of your greenhouses. So if you only have one greenhouse, you're only going to get to harvest one of your goods. Maybe it's tomatoes or something like that. So you'd only be able to do one. Even if there was 3 tomatoes on this card, you'd only be able to take one. However, if you had 2 greenhouses, that's pretty cool, because with 2 greenhouses, you can then harvest one good from each greenhouse. So getting a lot of greenhouses is something you'll definitely want to do, of course. That is definitely worth doing. Getting more greenhouses means at harvest time you get more goods. And then you can use those goods to advance on the table track. And so after you harvest, so after work time and after harvest time, then there's tourism time. And then during tourism time, that's when you'll use these bottles to pay the corresponding produce that you have to move up the tables. Because each of these tables have a dish of a particular good, or a particular vegetable. So this is a tomato dish, this is a lettuce dish, this is a mushroom dish. And so basically you're feeding the tourists on each table as you move up. That's when you will move up on the table track. There are other ways, of course, of moving up the table track, but that is the basic way you're going to do. Now here's what's really cool about the tourism phase. So during the tourism phase, let's say I have a tomato. Let's say I have a lettuce. Let's say I have a mushroom as well. Okay, so this is what I have. This is all I have right now. Let's just say that's what I have. And I'm currently here. And it's my turn to move up. During the tourism phase, you take your entire tourism phase one player at a time. The work time phase can be obviously different than that. But during the tourism phase, one player at a time, whoever's highest up here on this table track will go first, then clockwise from them. So basically, let's just say it was my turn to do tourism phase. I could pay a tomato back to the supply to move to the tomato table. I could then pay a lettuce to move to the lettuce table. And then I could pay a mushroom to be able to move to the mushroom table. And then you're thinking, well, I don't have any more goods, so I can't go any further. Well, not necessarily. At any point during the tourism phase, you can take the bonus. The bonus allows you to, instead of paying the corresponding vegetable, you get the corresponding vegetable to move there. So since I didn't have a cabbage, I could then instead take the cabbage to move to the next table. You must do that once per tourism phase for each player. It's something you must do. I don't know why you wouldn't want to do it, because you're getting a free vegetable, maybe more, depending on how high you are on the table track. But still, you must do it. But here's the cool thing. You don't have to do it last. That was just because I didn't have it and I had all first 3 here. Instead, for instance, let's say I had that. Let's say I had the lettuce, and let's say I had the tomato. I could pay the tomato to move up to the tomato. I could pay the lettuce to move up to the lettuce. And I still have this cauliflower here, but as you can see, I don't have the mushroom. I could now take the bonus to now take the mushroom, move up to the mushroom table, and then I could still pay the cauliflower here to continue moving. And if I had the carrot as well and more tomatoes, I could just keep moving as long as I had it. But I can only take one bonus per tourism phase, but I get to decide when I take the bonus. That's really cool. So that's a really interesting aspect. And then after that is all done, everybody during the homecoming time, there's going to be a number of, tokens here on the action, for the action phase of workers. They're going to get their workers back, basically. Now, when you play this game, normally, you can't put a worker on a spot that already has a worker on it. So that's not usually allowed. There are some instances where that could be allowed, but You can't do that. So going first obviously gives you the advantage of choosing where you're going to put a worker in order to do something. So that's the advantage. And in the first round, whoever recently did something with vegetables, I think it was, or something, would go first. But then at the end of each round, because there's usually about 8 rounds in the game, at the end of the 8th round, whoever's the highest on the table track here will be the winner after the 8th round, which is interesting. But, however, with that said, whoever is the highest up will get to go first in the next round. So the player who had this one, maybe they started going first in the first round, but maybe they're not the highest on the table track anymore. And so now it could be another color who is higher up that will go first by getting to place their first action token and doing the corresponding action. So that's basically how that works. Now let's get a little bit closer at those actions that I keep talking about. All right, so here's the actions that we have that we can use our workers for in order to take. There's various actions. Now, when you play solo mode, you have these two covered up. So this one is covered up, and this one is covered up. And that reason why these two are covered up in solo mode is because during solo mode, these are just too powerful for solo mode, and they don't want you to play with those two for solo mode because of that, because they're just too powerful for solo mode. But normally they wouldn't be covered up. Unless, of course, a player had already put their token there, of course, then it would be covered up and you wouldn't put your worker there unless there was some reason you could. And there are some ways you could do that. We'll talk about that later, how that might be possible as well. Anyways, so let's discuss this one here. This one says you can harvest up to 3 times or take 1 greenhouse. So let's say you would first, of course, in order to understand that, you would need to have 3 of these greenhouses basically in front of you. You would need to control 3 greenhouses. Because when you take this action that allows you to harvest up to more than 1 time, you must take from different greenhouses to do so. So if you couldn't take that part of the action by taking, you could. You could harvest up to 3. So if you only had 2, for instance, you could still harvest twice. But you wouldn't be able to harvest 3 times, unfortunately, because you didn't have 3. Or you can take a greenhouse, meaning there's a pile of greenhouses. You'll be able to take 1 greenhouse from the pile and add it to your greenhouse collection. So that's one of the types of actions that you can take there. And that's a pretty powerful one, of course. Then we have this one. Now, these 3 here are considered part of the property column. So over here, this one here, you'll discard any 1 good or take 1 greenhouse or seed at least 1 time. So you can discard a good to do one of the 2 things. Either take a greenhouse card, which I already explained how that works, or you can seed at least 1 time. Well, you need 2 things in order to seed. First of all, in order to seed, you need an empty greenhouse. So you need a greenhouse that doesn't have another vegetable. Now, there are some special cards in this game that could change that, where you could actually have more than 1 type of vegetable growing in the same greenhouse. But more than likely, you would need an empty greenhouse in order to seed at least 1 time. Now, the cool thing about that is when it says at least 1 time, if you have multiple greenhouses that are empty, you could technically seed more than 1 greenhouse. So if you had 2 that were empty, you could actually seed 2 greenhouses instead of 1. But not only do you need an empty greenhouse to seed, but you also need, well, the vegetables. You basically need to have a vegetable to turn it into a bunch of seeds. So, for instance, if I had a tomato and I decided to seed, I could seed this, and then I would actually take the rest of these tomatoes from the supply, and I would fill up the rest of the squares, or the rest of the plots of land on this card, which would actually be 4 more. So I'm only using one of my goods in my supply to seed, and then I get to put 5 more tomatoes on this card. And then, when I start to harvest from here, I'm going to start getting tons more tomatoes than I would have if I hadn't harvested it at all, of course. So basically, that's how that works. So that's what seeding does. And so that's the action that you could possibly take. All right. Now, let's move on to this one. With this action here, you can take 1 tomato and you can take 1 random greenhouse. Okay? There's a pile of greenhouses. It's a little different for solo, but if you were playing with multiple players, there's a pile of random cards here. You would take one of these randomly, and you would also get a tomato. So that's another action you could take. Obviously, in the solo variant, it's not so much the case with that one. But still, that's something you could do for sure if you were playing multiplayer. And that's the first 3 actions in the property column that you could do. The next one is, hold on. So the next one is field actions. So this one is the field actions column. This one is the market actions column. And this one is the town hall actions column. There's a reason why that is important, the columns here. You'll notice some of these have flags. This one's got a flag, this one has a flag, and this one up here has a flag, and this one over here has a flag. Per round, only one of these flags in each column can be taken. So normally when you're playing multiplayer, if somebody's already taken one of these here, for instance, okay, and just pretend the pink one isn't there. If someone had taken this flag earlier, another player in the same round cannot take this flag because it's in the same column. Same thing with over here. If one player took this one up here, this flag, another player therefore could not take this one here because it's in the same column. So that's something to note that you can't do. So anyways, let's get back. So what does this action here do? You can harvest up to 2 times or take 1 mushroom. When you take an action that allows you to harvest, you can harvest. So let's say, but this one says you can harvest up to 2 times, right? So you would have to harvest from 2 different greenhouses if you wanted to harvest up to 2 times. You couldn't take 2 from the same greenhouse. That's not allowed. But if you wanted to harvest up to 2 times with that ability, you would have to have 2 greenhouses full of produce, at least with 1 produce at most, obviously at least 1, in order to take from there. So that's basically what that means. If you didn't have 2 greenhouses and you took that action, and you just had 1, you could just harvest the 1 time, which is why it says you can harvest up to 2. Or you can take a mushroom, because that's pretty easy. You just take a mushroom from the supply, which, you know, is this. That's the mushroom. So that's what you could do. This action here says seed at least 2 times. Now this one is a must to know. When you seed, if it says you have to seed at least 2 times, that means that in order to seed, you have to have an empty greenhouse. And you have to also have a vegetable as well to seed. So if you had 2 greenhouses but only 1 vegetable, you could not seed at least 2 times. You could only seed 1. And therefore, you would not be allowed to take that action because it says to seed at least 2 times. So here's another thing. let's say you did have 2 vegetables, but let's say you only had 1 greenhouse. You can still only seed 1 time, and so therefore you would not be able to take that action. Seed at least 2 times. So that's how that works. So that's something to note for sure. Okay, let's move on. Now, another action you can take when it's pretty simple is you can take 1 tomato and seed 1 time. So hey, maybe you couldn't seed at least 2 times. But this one says you can seed 1 time and you also get a tomato. So that's pretty easy to understand. Then we have over here, we have harvest 1 time and take 1 lettuce or 1 cauliflower. Now, this is the only way you're going to get cauliflower unless you take cauliflower from one of the tables during the tourism phase or tourism time. So that's something worth doing for sure if you need to get some cauliflower. But you could also take a lettuce if you need it instead of the cauliflower, and you can still harvest 1 time. With this action here, you can take 2 mushrooms, or you can take 1 carrot, your choice. Once again, this is the only one here that has the carrot on it. So unless you took the carrot during the tourism phase, where you used your bonus to move to a table that had a carrot on it or more, that would be the only way you could get carrots in the game. So that's something to note. Or you could take this action over here that says take 2 tomatoes or 2 lettuce. Alright, so then we have these 3 actions over here. With the first one here, you can discard 3 greenhouses to immediately advance by 2 tables. So let's say you did that. Let's say you had 3 greenhouses you didn't want. You could discard them right now, 3 of them, to move your bottle here, your manager bottle here, and you could move it up 2 spaces. So if it was already here on the carrot, for instance, and this is still technically the worker phase, but it says immediately. You would just immediately move it up 2 tables. And you could use that very strategically. Maybe the next 2 tables are tables that don't have produce that you can't use anyway, or something like that, to move anyway. So that could be a strategic move, and it could also help you go first, too, the next time around. So that's one of the things you could do. The other action here is you can take 1 service card or discard any 3 different goods, because they'd have to be different, to take 3 identical goods. So you could discard 3 different goods, like a mushroom, lettuce, and tomato, to get, 3 carrots, because that would be identical, and the others would be all different. Now, what is a service card? We haven't gone over service cards. Well, when you play solo game, you only play with 3 solo cards, and there's only certain ones you can actually play with technically when you play solo. But you're going to have these solo cards here, and so as an action, you can actually take a service card. When you play with 2 players, there's 5 of these. You'll choose one to take, and you'll get to keep it, and you'll have this awesome ability for the rest of the game. They each do a variety of different things. The rooster here says at the start of work time, each round you may seed 1 time. So that's like a free action you can take. Another one here that I really like is this one here. Whenever you seed at least 1 time, you may harvest 1 time at the same time. So that's geothermal heat pump. So that's a pretty cool ability too. And so that's something you could do. Now, when you are playing with 2 people, when you are playing with 2 players, and there's 5 of these cards as well, once the first 2 are gone in a 2-player game, you actually have a little pile here. You won't have it on the board, obviously, but you'll have this little stack of goods. There'll be 3 of them, with a mushroom on the bottom, a lettuce on top of that, and a tomato on top of that. Okay? So when there's only 3 of these service cards remaining, the player who takes the first service card of the last 3 remaining also gets to take a tomato. The next player who takes the second to last one gets the lettuce, and the player who takes the very last service card gets a free mushroom as well. So that's how that works. But when you play solo, you only play with 3 of these, and you also get access to these. So the first service card I would take in solo mode, it would actually give me the tomato. and so on. And so that's how that works. Then the last action is basically similar to this one up here, except with this one you can discard one greenhouse to immediately advance by 1 table. But remember, if you're playing multiplayer and you put an action worker here, that means no other player, including yourself, can put a worker up there. So that's something to note. So that's basically everything you need to know in order to play this game. There's a few things to maybe mention in solo mode, but we'll go over that in the next video while I actually start playing solo mode for this game. Thank you guys for watching.